is Brian Brethen. I'm the operations manager at La Jolla Logic, and I lead our security consulting and compliance services programs. On the line with us, we do have our president and CEO, Stacey Fuso, who founded the company a little over 10 years ago. And we'll talk a little more about the company here momentarily. What I'd like to provide you is some insights into cybersecurity today. What are some of the significant trends that we see in the context of evolving concerns or risks to your companies, and then some things that you can work towards to better protect your information. So a little bit about La Jolla Logic. We are a woman-owned small business. Stacey is the owner of the company. We also provide advanced technology, research and development into hard science type engineering for unmanned platforms. We work for a number of Department of Defense agencies, including Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force, to include the U.S. Space Force, where we have a significant footprint. And then we support very strongly the defense industrial base with that compliance services I was mentioning. And we'll talk about why compliance is important and may relate to your business model as you move forward and try to navigate these challenging times. One of the key things about the threat, most of you, I'm sure, watch news regularly and hear a lot about ransomware attacks. So that has become increasingly prevalent to the point in 2021, there were more than 90 widely publicized attacks and over $600 million worth of just ransoms alone paid. The reason this is changing is there was a significant development in late 2020 where essentially cyber criminals took a model from the business community and created ransomware as a service. Very much the same as you can get an M365, you can now be really not very computer savvy and buy a do-it-yourself kit to start hacking other people on the dark web. Other trends that we saw in 2021 were a significant increase in the pressure on companies that have been attacked under ransomware. So no longer are they just encrypting the company's data and their drives and their computers to make them not usable. They're first exfiltrating that data. They're stealing your information, then threatening to either publish that data and sell it on the dark web or publicly name and shame your company for having been attacked successfully, so that increase that pressure and cause companies to go ahead and pay those ransoms. And then we've seen a significant increase in the speed of exploitation. And what we mean in terms of that, you may have heard last year about the exploit of the Log4j exploit, which affected a lot of companies using cybersecurity software of all things, like Splunk. And that went from being a known vulnerability that was detected to being exploited across multiple companies in a matter of days. In the past, what we saw was it would take weeks to months for an exploit to truly be, a threat to companies. So speed of response becomes a significant issue, even for small businesses. That brings me around to a change we've seen in who are the victims. You probably remember, the big names, Colonial Pipeline, and we'll talk a little bit about them. But that's changing. This proliferation of ransomware as a service means there are more and more cyber criminals out there. There's also what we call advanced persistent threats, or nation states that are sponsoring cybersecurity attacks for two reasons. One is you would expect to gain intelligence on Department of Defense and on the United States, but more importantly, to steal intellectual property. China in particular has been very overt about their intent to copy US intellectual property and become the economic superpower of the world. It occurs throughout supply chains. Larger companies have been investing a lot in cybersecurity. They're becoming harder targets. So cyber criminals are now moving to smaller and smaller companies that may not be very well protected. We know from last year's data that over 60% of the attacks in the world were against the Americas, meaning North and South America, and that 42% of those attacks targeted professional and legal services. So any type of engineering service, any type of consulting service, those types of businesses are in the biggest wedge of targets. Secondarily, we see healthcare and then manufacturing. In those three targets are routinely being hit. When I mentioned that there's been an increase, we noted that in the first 6 months of 2021, there were $590 million worth of ransomware-related activity. That's a pretty significant uptick from all of 2020 was only $416 million worth. So you're looking at year over year dramatic increases. Taken as a whole, it's really important to understand that even small businesses are at risk, and there are things you can do about that. So understanding that risk really starts with the dollar value. One of the changes we've seen over time is it sat pretty steadily in the mid $3 million. This is about what it costs a company of 50 to 100 employees to recover from an attack. Well, that is starting to increase, and it's starting to increase pretty significantly. What we saw in 2021 is that ransomware attacks averaged a cost of $4.24 million to a company. That's the cost of potentially paying the ransom, for lost business, for doing the repair work to try and secure your network, and then that outreach to your customers and clients to reassure them and to pay for any damages they may have experienced as a result of that data breach. As I mentioned, the targets are pretty widely spread. In around 2016, Department of Homeland Security identified 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Well, in 2021, we saw major attacks, and I mentioned Colonial Pipeline earlier, against information technology, healthcare, transportation systems, food and agriculture, defense sector, government and public services, and financial services. This is growing exponentially across the different sectors of industry. For the Colonial Pipeline, most of you remember folks on the East Coast had a real issue trying to get gasoline that lasted for about 2 weeks. And this was a fairly benign attack. Just a few months later, we saw the JBS Foods attack, where meat packing plants across the country were unable to run their systems, process. That meant grocery store shelves emptied out pretty quickly, and the price of meat doubled after it had already doubled in COVID. So, these different issues we're seeing across really, the biggest issue I think we're seeing is that I mentioned nation state actors, the combination of cyber criminals and nation state actors specifically targeting not just to ransom you and make money, but to take your intellectual property is becoming a significant concern. From a great video, if you get a chance to watch it, and I'll go back to the FBI on this, is Made in Beijing, because it talks very candidly about the nature of this threat, even to small businesses, where, is FBI Director Christopher Wray quoted, "We've now reached a point where the FBI is opening a new China-related counterintelligence case about every 10 hours. That's 5 new cases every 2 days. That's new businesses being attacked every couple of days. It is a whole of state effort that is a long-term Chinese strategy to become increasingly competitive and overtake the US as an economic power. That's not just large firms. As I've mentioned before, this is really a focused effort to obtain information that they specifically are looking for. For example, there's a small company out of Charleston, South Carolina, that has a unique technology used in the energy sector. That company was a target last year, and it's just a small mom and pop organization. It's not, a big $500 million energy company. That's that targeting of the supply chain. So just because you're a small business doesn't mean you're going to be overlooked for bigger fish. It means that if you don't take time to do the basics, that you're going to find yourselves at increasing risk as the proliferation of bad actors continues to grow, and as nation states begin to focus more and more on smaller businesses that have unique technologies they want to obtain. So what can you do to protect yourself? Well, one of the things is take a look at cybersecurity insurance. That's also starting to become a challenge. What we've seen over the last 4 years is that cybersecurity insurance has changed in two basic ways. First, it's no longer part of a general insurance package. It's a unique insurance that you have to obtain. And the second is the price is absolutely skyrocketing. So we've seen increases in the number of companies getting cyber insurance. That's gone from 26% of companies that take out insurance to 47% from 2016 to 2020. So you see a steady climb in the number of companies getting cyber insurance. What we've also seen, as this chart shows, is a dramatic increase in the cost. For example, just in the last half of 2020, going into the first quarter of 2021, most insurance companies are raising their prices from 10 to 30%. I mentioned some of those sectors like healthcare, legal profession. Those companies are seeing increases in excess of 300% if you can get cybersecurity insurance at all. When that becomes, something that's important to you, you need to understand that not only are the costs going up, the coverages are being reduced, and there are an increasing number of requirements to obtain that coverage. It's now become, the baseline to have what's known as good cyber as your if you don't have certain set of fundamental controls in place, you won't even be able to obtain cybersecurity insurance. So this is getting towards that steps of what can you do? So some basics of cybersecurity. Most everyone's heard, make sure you use passwords and use strong, complex passwords. They're never fun to remember, but they work. And, that's something that you don't need an IT company to come help you out with. You can just set up basic passwords with your systems, and you can kind of help yourselves. The second thing, and this starts to get more technical, is you can separate duties. So, in a small 1, 2, 3, 4 person company, you typically have one person that's designated to make sure that everybody's computer has password requirements and set up. Those are administrative privileges for maintaining the system, to be able to download Windows updates or to manage your Microsoft 365 or Google Docs account so that everyone can access data appropriately. You want to separate that administrative privileged account from the person's normal account so that they're not, when they're doing their regular daily workload of your business, they're not having that admin access. So you keep those things separate. The second most important thing you can do is train your team. The number one consistent path for bad actors into your network is phishing. More than 70% of last year's attacks were because somebody got an email and clicked on a link, or they went to a site that was compromised and they were fooled into giving up credentials. the best way to protect your company is to train your employees to recognize phishing, not click on those things, and then move forward so that you avoid that risk of compromise of credentials. Second thing you can do is make sure you put in checks and balances when you're publicizing information about your company so that you have somebody that screens it to ensure that what you're going to post publicly is what you mean to post publicly. That doesn't seem like an obvious, avenue of approach, but it is amazing how much information can be gathered about an organization just by visiting a couple of websites and reading a couple of press releases. So you want to think through the information you share to reduce that likelihood you're a primary target or that you're potentially giving away just what you have in terms of intellectual property and where that might be hidden. A layered defense. This is kind of cybersecurity basics, but it's an important one. And this goes with, if you have a wireless network in your office, make sure that it's encrypted. Make sure that you password protect those laptops and desktops that you do your routine, office work or engineering services or whatever the business model is. Those computers do need to be secure. Use effective antivirus and malware tools to make sure that every single system has software protecting it just in case a bad actor gets one step closer. And then make sure you patch those systems. That's the Windows updates. If you have servers, it's making sure that your servers are updated. And one that often gets overlooked is make sure that your routers and firewalls, if you have those in your network, that you periodically are scanning those and performing updates for their firmware. And then lastly, back up your data. If you're using a cloud-hosted environment, whether it's Amazon or Google or Microsoft to store your company data, that's a good first step. Those tend to have very good security out of the box. They tend to be backed up, but that doesn't necessarily ensure that the person that works from their desktop and saves files locally has their data backed up. Making sure you do that ideally at least weekly, preferably daily, to ensure that if you should have an attack, you have a means by which to recover and minimize any loss of the work performed. When you do those backups, you want to ensure that those are stored separately from your main network. That way, if you should have ransomware attack, an endpoint becomes encrypted and not recoverable, you still have a backup that's not on that network, that wasn't encrypted, that you can access and put on a new hard drive, a new piece of equipment if necessary, so you can get that business back up and running quickly. From there, there's things where perhaps you do want to get some help with from IT services, where you start to implement really strong protections like multi-factor authentication. You're familiar with the basics of you go to a website, you've enabled it, now you either get a text message or you have an authenticator application. Perhaps you have a biometric on your Windows machine that requires a fingerprint or a face scan for your phone. That type of authentication increases the security posture. And then establishing policies within your company to limit access of your network and your information to approved devices. Now, approved devices could be bring your own device, as long as you've taken the precautions to ensure those devices are secured, implemented with good updates. But that the real key here is making sure that you understand not just who can connect to your network, but what can connect to your network. Building on the training that we mentioned earlier from phishing and so forth, consider insider threats. One of the common vulnerabilities we see isn't always, a disgruntled employee, which is what most people think of with an insider threat, but it could just be an employee that made a mistake or was negligent in their duties. These things happen, and they happen all too often where something we didn't mean to send got sent out. Spending the time and investing in some training to remind people periodically, what is or isn't okay, or how do you detect whether an employee is starting to go down a path that you want to try and respond to. That training is really valuable protection. And then building on that, an incident response plan. So there are steps to be taken, particularly if your company works in any of those 16 critical infrastructure areas. Then there are federal government regulations within the US to report to cybersecurity information agencies, and that timing in which those reports have to be shared. Responding to US CERT reporting, that's what this response plan is about, training your team about how to recognize a threat, what can you do about it to secure a network, and then who do you have to report to legally to ensure that you continue to operate your business and minimize damage. And then back to the topic of layered defense, there are things you can do to help further protect your network. There's things such as a sender policy framework, which takes care of outbound emails, ensuring that those cannot be spoofed. You know, an attack vector that we have seen is a bad actor has obtained access to your Exchange server or your email sending server, and then is now sending emails, spam, out of your domain. A sender policy framework or technical controls in place to prevent that from occurring. Endpoint detection and response. This is software designed to periodically scan and check the state of those laptops and desktops on your network to ensure they haven't been compromised, to ensure that they are appropriately configured, that nobody's disabled your antivirus or other challenges for compromise to those laptops and desktops. A security and information event management system periodically checks all the logged events that your network does. So if you have somebody attempting to log in and that login attempt fails, a SIEM system records that. And if you get above certain thresholds, it cues you in to go take a look at that particular system to see if somebody is making multiple attempts to hack your system or is otherwise bad events occurring on your network, to cue you into when it may have been. Consider outsourcing or if you get larger, having your own 24/7 security operations center. These are IT operations that are focused expressly on watching your network in real time to see how it is performing and where communication is going. A security operations center enables you to respond very rapidly in the event of a breach. So we talked about costs. We talked about things you can do to idealize those costs. One of the key things to recognize is that of all the things that affect the cost of insurance, that affect the cost of a breach, the number one risk is compliance failure. There are a great many cybersecurity features or frameworks that establish best practices or if you would, the requirements to which companies should comply to protect their information. These can span from, perhaps familiar to you would be PCI, but at the basic end of cybersecurity, COBIT 2019 or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, that establishes that sort of good cyber I was mentioning a few slides ago. And then there are more advanced frameworks like the NIST SP 800-53, which is this huge library of cybersecurity requirements that can have a low risk profile up through a very high risk profile. We specialize in a number of these frameworks, in particular the NIST Special Publication 800-171 and the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification process, where you're looking at that moderate risk profile. And we find that companies that apply these controls have the lowest risks as far as vulnerability in their network. one of the big key takeaways. It used to be you didn't have to outrun the bear, you had to outrun the person next to you. That's not the case anymore. There are so many bears that you do have to outrun the bear. And so, I would encourage you to take a look back through some of these controls, to find expert help if you need it, but implement at least good basic cyber hygiene. And where you get more comfortable or you feel like you can invest a little more, raise the bar, go for enhanced controls, find a consultant that can help you really protect your network. Because, we come from a small business. We really like to see your small businesses flourish and grow. And we'd like to put those thieves and those nation states that are hostile back in their box. So I'd like to thank you for your time. Let you know that put our contact information up here. If you'd like to know more about cybersecurity or the services we offer, please feel free to reach out.